Hello. In this lecture, we are going to consider the question of economic policy. This is a huge topic, but what we're going to consider specifically is whether there is a connection between the size of the state, of course that's state scope, and the prosperity of the economy. So is the success of the economy contingent upon the size of the state scope? That's what we're going to look at. And to start thinking about this, let's look at this comic. So I want you to just take a moment here, look at this, and then notice whether your automatic reaction to this is sort of positive or negative. So looking at this, does this strike you as complimentary of President Trump or as critical of President Trump? I think that there are probably both views among the viewers here. And so a lot of you are probably looking at this and saying, this is great, right? The size of the U.S. state, the state scope, is too large. There are too many regulations on businesses, and that's slowing businesses down. And what President Trump is doing in this cartoon is freeing business, and so that they can rise up like a hot air balloon and benefit society as a whole. So this is the idea that a smaller state will lead to more economic prosperity. I'm sure there are also a few of you who are looking at this and you see this as pretty critical of President Trump's policies, and you're worried, well, some of these regulations exist for a very good reason, and allowing businesses to sort of run wild and do whatever they please can have a lot of negative effects on people. And so a lot of you are probably thinking this is actually pretty critical of President Trump. This is a bad thing because we see him, benefiting big business by peeling away regulations. And so this is pretty much the heart of the issue we're going to be considering today. We're thinking about whether less government is always going to lead to better economic outcomes. To put this in terms of scientific inquiry, we are working to explain our dependent variable of economic success or failure, economic prosperity. To do so, we're looking at the independent variable of the size of the state scope, or the level of state interference in the market. Now, here's a little bit of data from the World Bank, and it shows the U.S. gross domestic product. Remember, that is the total size of the U.S. economy in billions. And so you see that we've had pretty steady growth since the financial crisis. And could we explain this as a function of the size of the U.S. state? Well, before we jump in, I'd like us to just remember my basic argument about states and markets, is that they need one another, right? If there's no market, then the state doesn't have anything to extract. Remember, the state requires us to pay in with our tax money for the state to exist in the first place. Well, if there's no economic activity, the state's not going to do very well. And so the state actually has a very, very strong incentive to have the largest amount of economic prosperity and economic activity within its society as possible, because more success for the economy means more success for the state, means that the state will be able to do more. And remember, the chief variable for us that explains, well, how much is the state doing? What's the scope of the state? That actually is how wealthy the society is. But of course, remember, the market also requires the state to function in the first place. On the one hand, if there is no contract law, then people aren't going to enter into exchanges. And of course, even more importantly, if there's no defense of private property, if the state doesn't exist to keep us out of that state of nature where what we have is always subject to the threat of violence, well, there's not going to be any trade. There's certainly not going to be any investment. So as we consider this, we should remember this, and we should also remember our perspective. And our perspectives will often shape how we see facts. And so you and I might be able to look at the same thing and come to very different conclusions. We can look at the same facts and come to different conclusions about what those facts mean about the world. And of course, we saw that with looking at that comic. We all had sort of different gut instincts as to whether that's a good or a bad thing, as to whether that was a compliment to President Trump or very critical of President Trump. Well, of course, we are probably, most of us, I certainly am, Americans growing up in this very classically liberal tradition. Remember, this classic liberalism of restricting the size of the state is very much the American ideology. And so we should think that our perspective is often going to be influenced by the classic liberalism that runs so strongly throughout our society, throughout our education, and throughout our own personal belief systems. So That would lead us to think, well, less state intervention in the market is going to lead to better outcomes. And indeed, there's a lot of empirical support for that claim. Remember, empirical meaning we can actually go out into the world and see this. First of all, we have the disaster of state socialism as embodied by the USSR and by its satellites in the Warsaw Pact. And this was a situation in which the state worked to produce everything. And so remember, when we talk about what the advantage of the market is, it's that individual firms and individual consumers are able to make their own decisions about what they want to produce and what they want to consume, and that allocates resources really, really well. Well, in the USSR, they worked to try and use the state to allocate resources. So everything from the production of cars to the production of notebooks to the production of apartments, they would say, okay, we are going to centrally plan this. We're going to look at some statistics on how many people we have, and we're going to build X number of cars, shoes, apartments, pens, notebooks, everything. Well, it just became too complicated, and it really messed up people's incentive structures, and it led to what we would call shortage economies, where people didn't have enough of anything. And really, there's an old joke. I've lived in Russia and Hungary, and in both societies, both of these societies lived under shortage economies. There's the same joke, which is that if you were somebody responsible for feeding your family, you would see a line on the street in front of a shop, and you would just get into the line. You didn't even know necessarily what they were going to sell, but you figured if there were people lining up, there was going to be something in the shops. The shortage economy is the problem that central planning kind of broke down, and there wasn't access to basic goods, really basic goods like flour and toilet paper and soap in the stores. And so if you saw a line, you just jumped right in. Another example that we can look at as an empirical support for the claim that state intervention in the market can really mess things up and harm economic prosperity is the idea of import substitution industrialization. Now, your textbook goes into much more detail on this, but the basic idea is trying to increase the amount of economic prosperity by the state leading industrialization, right? And instead of having people have access to any given car, whether it's a Ford or a BMW or a Hyundai or a Honda, you say we are going to put big tariffs on these cars coming in, and then we're going to manufacture our own cars. And so here is a picture of the Yugo, which was the official car of Yugoslavia. And you probably don't see a lot of old Yugos on the street, and that's because they were pretty crappy cars. The idea was they were going to put high tariffs on anything coming into Yugoslavia, and so it made it very expensive to buy a foreign car, and that was supposed to give a big advantage to domestic car production, like the Yugo. Well, the problem of this is that it takes out what makes the free market work so well in the first place. It took out any competition. And import substitution industrialization, which was tried in lots of the developing world in the late 20th century, really just proved to be disastrous in society after society after society by making everything more expensive and by having domestically produced goods that, because they didn't necessarily have to compete on the market, they weren't very good quality. A more broad problem would just be the problem of government overspending. And government overspending can cause all sorts of issues. Of course, we've talked already about the Eurozone and the debt crisis. And when the government overextends itself, the debt becomes a very large burden on the entire society and can really harm both the economy and the state's ability to have high state capacity in the first place to actually do what the state is supposed to do. On the other hand, government overspending can also cause what is called inflation. And inflation is simply the idea that every day costs are going up. Inflation is the problem that perhaps your wages stay the same, so you still make $40,000, but everything got a lot more expensive. So that same amount of money that you have is not going to buy as much stuff. Now, when there are economic crises, sometimes there's what's called hyperinflation, and that's every single day things are getting more and more expensive. And we've seen that in societies like Germany in between the world wars, where things like the price of a loaf of bread got to be, what a car or a mortgage should actually be because of such rampant inflation. So we see that there are ways that the government can really, really screw up the economy. But it's not that simple. We can't necessarily conclude that just increasing state scope decreases economic prosperity. And that's because if we look at the world, we have a lot of empirical examples where state scope has actually led to extremely successful economies. Now, in the United States, we have, as we've talked about, relatively limited state scope compared to other advanced industrialized democracies. But two of the other hugest economies in the world have very active states in their economies. And we'll look at Germany in particular. So Germany has a really unique economic system that actually involves a lot of state input. And this is a very regulated economy, and they really focus on producing human capital, really training citizens so that they are able to export really high quality goods. And so when you think of German goods, it's things like BMWs, like Siemens, which makes all sorts of high-speed trains. And these take a very, very skilled workforce, and the German government has led these companies in a lot of ways through training and through this Ordnungspolitik idea, which is simply the idea that every major business like BMW is going to have representatives of labor, representatives from the state, as well as representatives from sort of the shareholders making decisions. And so this is by German law, and it is something that seems way beyond the pale of what the state should be able to do from the US perspective. Of course, the German economy has done exceptionally well under these circumstances. Japan has sort of a similar model in many ways. Another place that we'll look is East Asia. For example, South Korea, which your text goes into great detail about, I think is a very interesting example. It really shows us that states can successfully lead great economic development. South Korea started, the 1960s as a war-devastated society, and today it is one of the biggest economies in the world, and certainly one of the most advanced. And here we have a Hyundai factory. Here we have a Samsung phone, right? And what South Korea actually did was target explicitly. We are going to target these high quality, high value goods for export. And the government actually really led this effort by government funded banks funding companies like Samsung and Hyundai in order to compete on global markets and export as much as possible. And this has been an enormously, enormously successful tactic. So, in conclusion, what we see is that we cannot say that the hypothesis that state scope necessarily leads to any sort of economic outcome is true. We don't have empirical support from that. We can go out into the world and we can find cases like the United States where a more limited state scope is associated with economic greatness. We can also find lots of cases where high state scope leads to devastation, like the USSR, like the idea of import substitution industrialization. However, when it comes to cases like Germany, Japan, South Korea, and many others, we see that well-crafted economic state policy, even state-led investment, can lead to great economic prosperity and enormous growth, as in the case of South Korea. So, as is so often the case, things are a little more complicated than we might have expected. Thank you. Have a great day.